Welcome to the CoSuccess in Conversation series. Welcome to today's episode of CoSuccess in Conversation. Today, we are going to be talking about having the conversations that need to be had. And I'm joined by Liz Beck. Liz is the CEO of AspiringHR in the UK. She is also an extremely seasoned coach and consultant, and we've worked together with a number of different clients over the years. Liz, welcome to CoSuccess in Conversation.
Thanks, Anton.
Let's kick off really going at the issue of why do you see this being such a challenging topic, this having the conversations that need to be had? What drives it?
I think that there are so many considerations in the system of a team and an organisation, which is fundamentally made up of a selection of different teams. And I think that there are so many levels of filtering that are going on within teams that get in the way of people being able to really put their voice to the stuff that matters most. And when those filters are in play and people don't feel they have we call it psychological safety, that notion of it's okay to say what I need to say without the relationship being on the line, that limits the potential for the team. It limits innovation, and it limits the kind of tensions and challenge that often are needed to move a team on to the next level of their own brilliance. And I think that's just something that we tend to see turning up in teams time and time again and need to get after.
And I see that twice. I see it in a couple of ways, because I completely agree with where you're going. But what I found interesting, I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, what I find interesting is there's two sides to it. There's am I feeling safe to actually put out that difficult conversation? Is sometimes because I can justifiably, I've seen my boss explode at 3 people in the last week. Yeah. I am not going to put that out there. I could be in danger. But there's another one where, a boss 5 years ago once did it to somebody, and now I don't ever do this in meetings. And I've got myself so caught up in my own fear or concern of looking stupid or saying something awkward that I don't even go there myself. So, I think there's there's the reality of it, which is real in certain cases, but there's also the perception of it. And they both seem to end up at the same place you said, where we end up not having those conversations and we just duck them. What are the kind of, have you got some sort of top of mind examples where you've seen, I've seen a couple of these. One is where it was kind of a really big deal and they needed to have that conversation because it was very strategically significant to the team. I've seen other ones where it wasn't actually such a big deal, but by not getting the small ones sorted, it made the bigger ones even harder to have later on. What's your experience been with it?
Yeah, well, I think, there are many examples in many sectors where my take would be that the absence of those conversations has ultimately led to the demise of an organisation and sometimes a sector. I mean, I think if you cast your mind back to the financial crisis, there is that notion of what conversations weren't happening that could have saved some of that global catastrophe. Because it's hard to comprehend that people didn't know what was going on in different corridors of those institutions, and yet something prevented that leaning in to the discussions that need to be had. And maybe that would have written history in a different way. There's all sorts of other examples in the tech space. Back in the day when you and I might have gone and rented a Betamax video from somewhere, that didn't last very long, did it? And now we're streaming. There's so many examples of where innovation and the willingness to go in a new direction has been both the birth of something new and, in many cases, the death of something that once was such a prominent place in its market space. And I think the likes of Apple are organisations that have really nailed some of this when they have essentially incubated spaces for teams to have the freedom to play and bring creativity and to create something new that isn't currently out there, isn't in the mainstream, but to get to test it And so I think there's a real correlation between having challenging conversations and having playful and innovative conversations. And there's kind of both sides of new organizational successes and past demises.
Yeah, I like where you're going with that, because it's really more of a continuous scale, right?
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
Conversation. It can be a bit of banter back and forth, but then it can get a little more two different points of view, and then it can get more challenging. But if you don't do this stuff up here, to go straight at this can feel very daunting. To launch into, we have a problem, we need to have this conversation. That is a learned skill, and it's learned more by having lighter disagreements. I don't agree with you, Liz. I don't think that's the right way to go. Why would you do it that way? Why don't you do it this way? Well, now we're creating exactly your point back to when you were talking about psychological safety. That's a psychologically safe space where at the end of it, we either go, actually, you've got a great point, I'm changing my mind, or, hey, let's just agree to disagree, but we don't have the consequence of, oh, am I now in trouble with Liz? Is she going to fire me, or not invite me to this next meeting, or whatever it might be? And I think it's often underestimating the sort of, what do they call it? The short-term pain of actually getting into the conversation with the longer-term effects of, if I don't have that conversation, exactly to your point, what are all the things that are going to happen that's going to cause us problems down the road? Why,
Yeah.
When you look at teams that you've worked with, have you picked up, I know you've got great antenna, do you have certain things when you watch teams already coming in as an outside observer where you'd kind of go, yeah, I suspect this team may have difficulty with having those difficult conversations? Normally you make a point. We don't normally invite outsiders in when things are going great. Usually there are issues going on and stuff happening. But as you look at it, and you've got a wealth of experience on this, where are some of those sort of watch out signs or little things that you pick up on that gets you sort of going and digging deeper on that?
Yeah, I think I've got to a place in my experience with teams where it really is quite a felt experience. So quite early on, I can sense where some of it is sitting, and I think it's really important to stay in a discovery phase to ensure that you're not making your own 2 + 2 = 4 kind of assumptions in that. So in all of our teamwork, we start with that discovery process to ensure that there's a space one-to-one with each of the team members to understand what is going on from your perspective. And as you build that picture, you get a theme of perspectives that tend to give you a more accurate kind of diagnostic. It's a real range of stuff from, the boss has cast a shadow essentially and set a tone. And to your point earlier, somebody's seen that boss have an impact on somebody at some point, and they tend to think, yeah, I'm not going to let that be me next time. Other times there's all versions of our egos coming to the room. And let's be clear, we've all got an ego and it comes with us into the room. It's the extent to which it does and what's the intention behind it when we're speaking into a team space to know what impact that has on others. Some of the time it's simply that the team hasn't had enough time together.
That's a good point. Yeah.
They're in that classic kind of forming stage, or even just kind of plateauing into the rhythm. They haven't gone beyond the surface and dug in. The area we're going after in team performance, as you'll know, Anton, is can they create and innovate and problem solve and move the needle together in a way that is in greater service when they're all a part of that than individually. Mm-hmm. And when teams spend time together, they build rapport and relationship. Through that process, they develop an understanding of where they are with each other and deepen their trust. And it's in that place that they can be playful, because you need to be free to lose some of your inhibitions to be playful. And it's playfulness that helps creativity. And to your point about the continuum, having that base foundation of rapport and playfulness and safety makes it a whole lot easier to have the challenging conversations that are needed when the customer's not happy, when the sector's in trouble, when the numbers aren't adding up, when the talent's gone toxic, whatever it might be. You're not going to bite down on those if you haven't built some of that foundation first.
It's a really good point. And I think I'm working with a couple of organizations on onboarding programs and assimilation programs, and it's kind of new senior leaders coming in. And it's been interesting that, to your point, that idea of giving a team the time to gel, get together, get familiarity, build some level of trust. But what's interesting to me, I find, is they'll often say that and then just sort of wait for it to occur, when there's actually a lot of things you can do to accelerate that, to actually,
Sure.
Speed that up. And a lot of it comes out of increased level of self-awareness. A lot of it comes out of one of the two things that I will tend to look at when I'm watching teams is, one is trying to keep a rough feel of airtime, who's talking within a team. And more specifically, the quieter ones, is anybody making the effort to go, Jack, you haven't said anything for a minute. Like, what's your thoughts here? So inviting them in, that's one. The second one I look for a lot, and you made a really critical point, is particularly in these areas, how the leader turns up or shows up in any given setting or any meeting or any team is very powerful. It's oversized. And so what we tend to look at is the approximate ratio of what we kind of call inquiry versus advocacy. How often are they making a statement? Well, here's what we've got to be doing. It's obvious. Why wouldn't we do it that way? To, I'm wondering, is this the right way to go? Anyone got some other thoughts like that? The second you turn it into an inquiry and you get into listening, what's the great phrase? Nobody listened themselves into trouble. A lot of people talk themselves into trouble. Very few people listen themselves into trouble. And I think this plays into this. If I want to have a conversation, if I'm not actually confident that you're not going to even hear it, even if I'm not afraid, why would I bother? It's maybe just not a good use of my time. It's like, every time I've tried to talk to this individual, they just kind of goes right over their head, or they don't hear it.
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, as you're saying, I'm reminded of a whole host of different teams that I've worked with over the years. And I have seen examples of individuals in a team. Sometimes they're the leader, sometimes they're one of the leaders in the team. And there's a big difference between listening and hearing, I've noticed. So I have seen leaders give enormous apparent airtime to the rest of the room, but that does not equate to them hearing it or taking it on board. And if that becomes too much of a rhythm, the rest of the team knows that this is the dance for you to decide what you're going to do anyway. So what they start to do is self-select how much they put a view into the room, for fear of the view not being the right one when it comes to assessment at the end of the circle, if you follow what I mean.
Almost like,
so I think there's all sorts of different things playing out team to team. I've also seen teams who've worked together for 5, 7, 10 years and yet never worked together as a team, because every exchange has been transactional, operational, or on the surface. And sometimes they just need the help to both come together and then dig down a few layers to start into the trust space.
That's a really good, yes, let me build on that. So actually, if I follow you down that path, what we're sort of saying is comfortable teams are actually potentially less likely to have those conversations that need to be had, because they don't want to rock the boat, or they like being in that comfort zone, which is a very dangerous place to be, versus a team that just goes, look, I know this is not going to be easy, but we need to have, here's the elephant in the room. We need to have this conversation, or whatever it might be. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's the space between institutionalized average and going for high performance.
Well, like that.
And if you take a glance at the sporting world, you don't have to look too hard to see the real difference. The tolerance levels of average are so much lower, and therefore the correlation to the amount of challenge that goes into, that what's the marginal gain here and how we're going to get it. It shows up in the sporting world in a very more obvious way. But that's what we're looking at when we're looking at high performing teams in the organizational context as well.
Let me build on where you're going. That's really interesting, because we've been working with a couple of teams more recently and got into having the conversation around conflict. And we can talk a bit about maybe some of the differences in the UK versus US between teams and things like that. But on a lot of the teams, there is a real nervousness. Even when you use the word conflict, you can kind of get people getting a little antsy and a little worried. And one of the things we'll do is a sort of what we call a conflict comfort level check, where we simply ask around the room, are you more or less comfortable with conflict in the team? And no team is ever all one way or the other. There's always this mix. And so when you actually start looking at that, I'm wondering if for a lot of people, they tend to just associate the difficult conversation with conflict. I am conflict averse, therefore I don't actually even want to have I don't want to even open the door to the difficult conversation. Have you seen something like that?
Yeah. Very often. I think that, if we think about I'll use this loosely, but if we think about the neuroscience behind what we're describing here, we are creatures who put our actions out there in a response to our emotions. So it's our emotion that's driving what we're doing, and our emotions are a response to the relationship we have with whatever the issue is. If you accept that we come into the world fairly open to those kind of influences. And so when we're seeing people in the room struggle with conflict, that's because there's an emotional response to the idea of it, whether it's the word and what that's socially defined as, or whether that is their own experience with conflict. So for me, I'm always curious about what is the relationship you have with the notion of whatever the topic is, whether it's conflict, whether it's courageous conversations, or whether we reframe it to what's the relationship we have with what is needed to be the best we can be. It's the outcome we're going for. How people get themselves into the system can influence their responses hugely. And I think that if we can help them unpack the intention behind the discussion, they tend to be able to walk into it much more than if they start from a place of conflict.
Yeah, it's in fact, even when you pick the kind of the topic around having the conversations that need to be had, how I hear that more often is having the difficult conversations.
Exactly.
But if I build on your idea of the second I think a conversation is going to be difficult, my emotions are now in full flow, which means that I am not going to be in necessarily a relaxed, comfortable place to have what is there. And it's well known that fear crushes creativity and, listening skills go down. So, we're almost setting up the perfect storm of how not to have a conversation even before we walked in the room.
Exactly. And we're playing with, do we want to create a frame for people to be in avoidance or approach?
Yes.
Right. So
yeah, exactly.
If you say to most people, are you committed to telling the truth today? They're more likely to say yes than no. Right. If you say to people, are you committed to walking straight into conflict today? They're more likely to say, could we take a rain check on that? Right. So
it's Monday, Liz. I'm going to get to Friday.
Exactly. So I think there's something about having the foundations of trust and rapport in place, but then building something that people have a shared purpose towards and feel committed to. And that's often in service of something that's going to do the team well or do the organization well. And typically I see them much more comfortable in engaging with some of the tools that would help those conversations if they see it in that frame.
I like that. Now let's get on the last thing is, reality is we've been dealing with, and most companies are dealing with, virtual teams, working from home, distributed teams. This is becoming, at least for the last 2 years, has been the norm.
Yeah.
How do you feel, well, a couple of things. How do you feel having those conversations that need to be had? Has it got harder? Has it got easier? And what might be some tips and suggestions or experiences from you around those that are in that distributed or virtual situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, because on first considering, one might think the answer is, if I haven't got to be in the room with them, I can just click leave on the Zoom button. It's going to be a whole lot easier because I can just say, click leave, and then send an email afterwards. You might think that's the way forward. And yet it's not what we've seen and heard. what we've seen and heard is that those conversations are much harder, and therefore they're getting kicked in the long grass because we're waiting for when I might see them in 6 weeks' time, or when, you know, restrictions might lift, or whatever it might have been. So it's been a really interesting thing to observe. And this is just intuition and gut, but I think what this tells me is that as human beings, we are still relational creatures. And so we need to lean into the non-verbals that enable us to hold a conversation like that, because there's something energetically that happens. Yes, you can see my eyes, you can hear the tone of my voice, you can see my facial expression, and it's potentially a whole lot better than not. But there is something energetically that shifts when we are in the same room, whether it's because we greet each other with a handshake, or even we say goodbye with a hug, whether we can pause for a moment and put a hand on someone's arm when they've heard a difficult message. The message can be difficult, the impact doesn't have to be destructive. And when you're in the same room, I think energetically you can hold that message in a different way. That's my absolute guess at why it is like that. No, I've certainly seen the pattern.
Yeah, I like where you're going, and you've got me thinking about it, because to your point, one thing that has gone down massively is the feeling of connection with my team or with other individuals. What's also happened is not only the quality of the connection, but the frequency of the connection has just gone bigger. Very often, if I'm having 3, 4, 5 good, encouraging conversations, to drop a more tough one in there, not the end of the world, because I'm kind of balancing out.
Exactly.
If I hadn't been having these conversations, I'm noticing a lot of relationships have become much more transactional. Consequently, I'm much more likely to walk in the meeting, okay, we've got a real mess. What have you guys been doing? You're messing us around, and we're moving into that more defensive thing out of the gate. One of the things we worked with a team, and what we've we've learned as we've been doing, because it's not like there's a rule book on this, but what we've learned as we've been doing, one was actually getting the team, enabling the team to have the conversation, how would we like to deal with disagreement on a call, in a Zoom like this? And that has been, in and of itself, a first step to start enabling things. Then from them, actually having them work through even an example. And what came up when we were doing this with one team said, it's interesting, I'm thinking about this slightly differently. I have to sort of deal with this issue more formally, and they didn't mean formally like letters, but they meant I need to actually define, almost like you were saying, I need to send you an email, let's say, Liz, next Tuesday's meeting we're having together, we actually need to talk about this. And I know it may not be the easiest of conversations, but let me share, here's some of my thoughts or my point of view, but let's work through it till we get to a good outcome. So they said by setting it up better, that was already, they could almost feel, thinking it through, talking it through, writing it down was helpful to them. Then setting the expectations of a given meeting. The worst thing on a virtual meeting is to sort of blindside somebody and go, right, I got you here, bang, I want to go and have this conversation with you, and they're just not prepared mentally, they may not have the data they need, whatever that might be. So there are things, I think, where if it's used mindfully, it doesn't necessarily have to be a no-go. I couldn't agree with you more. It is harder because, for exactly what you said, the body language, the empathy, the hand on the arm, whatever it might be, connection piece isn't there. But it's not a. I think it's more. It can be as much, to be fair, as much an excuse as well, do it virtually.
Exactly that, and I think that's the other side of this. So I completely agree with you. It's wholly possible, but I think how you contract for it by consciously having the conversation ahead of time. How do we want to do the important conversations in our team? So let's not call them the challenging ones or the conflict. Then you get to scope that out, because that invites individual to say, well, actually, for me, those kind of conversations are really uncomfortable. So I'd need this, but I know Fred would need that. Yeah. Nice, much better. I think the flip side is the person who wants to initiate the conversation, in the absence of the contract, starts to run a narrative about, oh God, that's going to be awful on a Zoom call, and then I can't get my arms around them. In which case I won't have it. And then what we get is institutionalized average, because we're avoiding the important conversations. So we have to work with the environment the world's given us through COVID, and it will continue, although it's not exclusive. As we've seen, organizations, there's a reason many have decided to get back into the office. Yeah. But this is the hybrid world now, and so there's no one size fits all. It's about having the contract in place to do those things the way the team needs them done, but not avoid them. That's the danger zone.
Excellent. Well, I know we could carry on talking a lot, but let's wrap this up now. I think I'll close it on that. I love that expression. So having the conversations that need to be had will avoid you from falling into the institutional average. I think that's a lovely expression. Thanks very much for your time, Liz. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Anton. Bye-bye.